My name is Dale Sinclair, and I'm Director of Innovation for AECOM based in London. Today, I want to talk to you about flow and how we can mobilize data for sustainable outcomes in our cities. And of course, many of our cities have been around for thousands of years, and sometimes it's hard to believe how much these cities have evolved over time because many aspects of our cities do not seem to change, because of course they have changed incrementally over many, many centuries. But for me, there's two core paradigm shifts in our cities that are crucial to how we move forward. And the first was the rollout of the infrastructure, which really took place in many cities at the end of the 20th century. And the second one was the rollout and introduction of the car in our city. And I'm going to come back to both of those points. But of course, the crucial thing around data is the introduction of the fourth industrial revolution, which is really driving a lot of smart city technologies. But of course, how do we define which technologies we use? This is a map of the construction technologies currently used, and many of us talk about the use of BIM as a technology to transform how we design and make buildings. But that's just one of many technologies that you can see in this diagram. So a big challenge for us is how do we figure out what technologies to use and what data might derive from those technologies. So if we're trying to get to our smart cities, what are the data kind of sources that would help us define better cities? But of course, before we even think about that, we need to remind ourselves that net zero emissions is driving transformation across the globe of how we design our cities. And of course, that has also been fired up and transformed by the introduction of COVID into our lives as the pandemic moves around the globe. So there's three themes I would like to talk to today about. And the first of these is how our cities can adapt and what data do we need to help that adaptation of our cities to be successful into the future. Now, in 2018, AECOM published a book on the future of the office. And we predicted back then that our cities would change, that because of housing prices and other drivers, people would start to move out of the cities to other locations to have a better quality of life. Now, of course, that has just been accelerated during the pandemic. And we're already working with many of our clients to figure out what does that mean for our clients who have many, many staff around the world, this resetting of how people work in the home, what that means for other locations where we might work within the community, for example, and how our main offices or campuses work together with the city centres that we live in. And I think it's still too early to figure out how that works, but certainly what city authorities need to do is to work with the users of the city to figure out how they are changing how they use their buildings. And certainly as AECOM, we see our buildings being different in the future. We see ourselves coming into the office to collaborate, maybe to have broadcast quality facilities, to use new and different ways of communicating with our clients across the globe. And we're still trying to figure that out as we go. But it's not just the buildings that we work in, it's also the buildings that we heal in. So for example, some of our healthcare clients are now looking at how they brief their healthcare projects as consultants and surgeons start to work in different ways. Consultants are now looking at working from home as telemedicine becomes more commonplace throughout the world. And of course, centers of excellence change as robotic surgery starts to mature across the world. And many other technologies are changing how we use our healthcare buildings. And some of these technologies and the data that they drive are quite small. So for example, small diagnostic centers allow us to move patients out of hospitals quicker. We're already seeing better diagnostics resulting in, and healthcare solutions resulting in the reduction of people that need a bed. So we're moving from outpatient facilities to inpatient facilities. And certainly working with one of our clients, Oxford University Hospital Trust, we designed a new master plan for them a few years ago And the crucial thing here was about making everything on the campus flexible. So the possibility that the new wards that we might design might in the future turn into different facilities for junior doctors or accommodation for nurses. And similarly, as we see healthcare spaces transforming, we have to have flexible spaces for labs or diagnostics. And most importantly of all, we're changing the campuses to face people rather than cars. So new forms of transport that we use, making much healthier places for our healthcare campuses to revolve around. But of course, it's not just how we come to these buildings. In the future, it may be that the healthcare comes to the patient. So just now we could say, well, let's bring the elderly patients to the hospital. But actually, maybe in the future, the hospital comes to the patient. And this is a hello care, an ACOM idea that we've been looking at in the US, which starts to look at how the diagnostics can come to the patients so that we actually reduce the size of our buildings by bringing the healthcare out directly to the people who need it. And similarly, in London, we've just gained planning consent for a major eye facility, which has research and clinical facilities. And this is one of the first buildings in the world that's designed as an adaptive hospital around circular economy principles. So we've designed it as a shell and core building. So in the long term, outpatients might change to surgical spaces or research spaces. And in fact, if Moorfields decide to move to a new facility, the building can actually be converted to homes or even a hotel. So that in the future, our buildings will have much longer lives and will be capable of adapting into lots of different uses as we start to figure out how to deal with net zero solutions. And of course, the next part of this jigsaw is not just buildings being adaptive, but we need to have an adaptive infrastructure. As I said at the start, many of our cities have been designed for the car, with the human or the pedestrian placed in second place. And of course, all around the world now, we're seeing a recalibration of this as cars start to get pushed to the fringes and autonomous vehicles start to be used more commonly in some locations. And of course, buses being given priority. And importantly, other forms of use being provided, so safe facilities for cycling and other new forms of transportation like electronic scooters. But of course, as we start to change these transport modes, we need a wealth of data to make decisions for designing cities. And even in Amsterdam, one arguably the home for the bicycle in the world, we're seeing a massive shift towards e-bikes. Now, e-bikes may look like a common bicycle, but they transform how people can move around the city. Elderly people can cycle further. Uh, Anyone can cycle further. And of course, this changes how we actually then have to use our building. We need to provide charging areas. We need to think about cities, even with hills, can now actually start to serve people that want to cycle more commonplace. And similarly, across the world, many cities have had challenges with e-scooters as they are dropped off in places that are perhaps our communities don't want to have scooters lying around. And certainly in the UK, the Department of Transport has been pushing out surveys to those using scooters. Who is using these scooters? Why are they using these scooters? What other forms of transport might they have used if they were not using a scooter? So we're trying to get that data to inform how we might design an infrastructure for these. We're now starting to put in kind of virtual locations to put bicycles in e-scooters so that they are not randomly left around the city. And really trying to figure out how do these form part of an overall integrated transport proposal. And of course, this resilience or adaptation of our cities is not just about what you see above ground. It's also about the utilities which are below the ground. And I'm sure many of you don't really pause in your normal day to think about how does the water come to my tap? How does that power reach the light switch which I have? Or how do the waste or gas come into my building? And that's really because more than a century ago, our Victorian kind of ancestors put in place in many cities across the world. These incredibly complex and huge infrastructure projects that we, in many respects, take for granted today. But of course, these infrastructure projects are now having to be reevaluated. As we look to net zero, we're having to drive significant reductions in the energy that we use in buildings. And we're starting to figure out, well, how can we reduce energy in building? And certainly across the world, we're now seeing clients using the Internet of Things and sensor technologies to actually figure out what is the energy used in the building. And in many projects, actually, it's predicted that IoT will bring 30% savings operational costs, which is more than the total capital cost of a building. So not only can energy be reduced by using Internet of Things, but also there's a huge reduction in the cost of that energy to our clients. But of course, as we look to new energy sources, we're actually having to look beyond the buildings that we've designed. We're looking into many, many different solutions. And certainly in London, for some of the buildings that we're designing, we're looking at very diverse energy sources, from collecting heat from waste systems, from renewables, from biomass, lots of different solutions. And of course, as more and more buildings start to use these diverse sources, we need to gather that data to figure out how those buildings are functioning. And coming back to the hospital that we've just designed in London, of course, as we design our hospitals, just now we have lots of disparate data sources around the circular economy, CFD analysis, many different things. We're manufacturing buildings more off-site. We're using all sorts of data sets around cost and carbon, and we're starting to roll out digital twins in our building. But of course, from a city perspective, it's not until we get these data lakes from all of these buildings and all the connectivity of that data that we can really start to drive transformation. We need to understand how the design and operation of these buildings is working, not just individually, but as a set. And in many cities, we're now, of course, digitizing all the assets so that we have an increasingly huge wealth of geometric information in which to make decisions around planning of our cities. And as I've already said, we're using the Internet thing, big data, and increasingly artificial intelligence to look at how we can better design our infrastructure. And in the UK, the Centre for Digital Built Britain is focusing on what's called the system of systems. And that's really starting to connect all of the systems in the UK to look at how our different infrastructure projects, when connected, can work more effectively. So a huge data initiative that will transform how the United Kingdom works into the future. And a lot of what I've spoken about to date has been really about adaptation of our cities to use less energy and for buildings to be more effective into the future. But cities also need to be resilient. We've certainly seen during the pandemic that when people want to have greater focus on wellness, and then certainly some of the new standards that we're working to, like the WELL standard, are focused on exactly that. So a big thrust for us with some of our clients is looking at that whole wellness. What are the things in a city that make us better? And of course, the green spaces that we use and access on a day-to-day basis are a crucial part of the cities that we use. But it can take 40 years for a tree to mature sufficiently. So this is not about adaptation. The resilience of our cities around green spaces means that we have to create these anchors. We can't make a green space adaptive. We have to figure out where these will go, the percentage of green space that we want, and how to get this balance of the city being able to adapt and the city being resilient with these fantastic spaces that will work with the new way that we work and live in our cities. And again, it's just trying to focus on the balance of what do we do at home and what did we do at work, and what are the spaces that we use and how do they impact on the wellness that we have, and how do we make our cities resilient for better well-being into the future. And the final, another increasingly important part of this resilience is also in the pandemic, we moved out into the streets. So we've been starting to change again from this car-centric city to one where we can have better eating facilities, more bike parking, more green spaces. So a crucial thing about the adaptation and the resilience of the city is not just about the permanent green spaces, but also the pop-up spaces that we might create as we start to move around linear infrastructure into new solutions for our cities. And the final part of the jigsaw for me, beyond just adaptation and resilience, is the materials that we will see in the cities of the future. Now, certainly many of the cities that we have just now are based around traditional construction using materials such as stone. But construction is going to change. Across the world, construction has been stagnant in terms of its productivity improvements. And what we're seeing is a shift towards manufacturing. Now, from this data here, you can see that shifting to manufacturing focus for construction doesn't just mean that we do less on site, which means we might build faster. It means that we can have better productivity. And certainly what we're now seeing is a convergence of construction and manufacturing into our cities. We want to make more of our cities in factories. But of course, that has an impact. And because construction has been around for thousands of years, and we're looking at all sorts of things around where is the factory of the future. From a carbon perspective, we maybe want local factories. And here's an example of a container that arrives in site. So we're seeing new manufacturing technologies coming to the site to make buildings more efficient to make. And we're also seeing the rollout of robotics. But I think what we will see in the cities is more and more factories popping up as local factories come to fruition. But of course, it's not just about the factory, it's about the materials that we use. And these two examples that you can see here are what I would call robots that are made to basically to assemble traditional materials. But really, when I see this, what I think when I see the thing on the right-hand side, we should actually be reinventing the brick for the robot of the future and the materials that are best for our planet into the future. So it's not just about factories, it's also about rethinking the materials we use and how can we use local materials more effectively. But this is actually quite difficult. And if I just take one material as an example, so here you can see the kind of carbon impacts of different types of insulation. And needless to say, the ones that have the highest carbon actually are the ones that are the easiest to make available. So actually transforming the materials we use is really tough. If we're going to scale the use of new materials, we need to look at just how to make them more available and how to transition from current materials that are available, which is no mean task. So in summary, today I've really spoken about how the cities of the future need to be resilient. We need to have anchors which are green, but we also need our buildings and our infrastructure to be adaptive, to be able of change over a long period of time. And of course, with less demolition into the future. And we also need to look at a new raft of materials that we use to construct our cities, which are perhaps sourced locally, even made locally. We need local factories. So the city of the future is going to be very, very exciting, but it's also going to be formed from a wealth of data and a whole plethora of new technologies. So thank you very much.